There's a specific kind of harm that carries a weight different from ordinary hurt, one that occurs when a narcissist turns their cruelty specifically toward the person who gave them the most patience, the most sacrifice, the most genuine, unguarded love they've likely ever received from anyone in their entire life. This isn't simply another instance of narcissistic mistreatment. It's a particular category of harm with its own specific psychological consequences, both for the person who was hurt and, less visibly, but just as significantly, for the narcissist who caused it. Today, I want to walk you through 6 specific things that happen when this particular dynamic unfolds, because understanding these 6 consequences reveals something important about the true, lasting cost of this kind of betrayal, a cost that extends far beyond the immediate pain of the moment it occurs. The first thing that happens is a specific, disorienting collapse of what psychologists sometimes call relational logic. The basic intuitive sense most people carry that effort and investment in a relationship should correlate, at least somewhat, with the treatment they receive in return. When someone has given genuinely, consistently, sacrificially to a relationship and receives cruelty specifically in return for that giving, something fundamental about how they understand relationships gets disrupted, not just with this specific person, but at a deeper, more foundational level. This collapse isn't simply disappointment. It's a kind of relational vertigo, a sudden loss of the basic navigational tools most people use to understand how closeness and treatment relate to each other, and this disorientation often persists long after the specific relationship has ended, affecting how the person approaches trust and vulnerability in every subsequent connection they attempt to build. The second thing that happens, specifically to the person who gave so much, is a particular insidious form of self-doubt that differs from ordinary insecurity in a crucial way. It targets not simply their judgment about this specific person, but their fundamental capacity to assess character and trustworthiness at all. If someone who gave everything, who was genuinely perceptive, genuinely caring, genuinely invested in understanding and supporting another person, still ended up devastated by that person's cruelty, the mind often searches desperately for an explanation, and one of the most common, most damaging explanations it lands on is a conclusion about the giver's own fundamental inability to read people accurately. This conclusion is almost always inaccurate, because we've discussed extensively in previous conversations how skilled narcissists become at concealing their true patterns during the early stages of a relationship. But the conclusion feels compelling anyway, precisely because it offers a kind of control. If the problem was your own poor judgment, at least that's something you could theoretically fix, rather than accepting the more disorienting truth that someone can be genuinely deceptive and genuinely skilled at concealing harmful patterns, regardless of how perceptive you actually are. The third thing that happens, and this one deserves careful, honest attention, is what occurs specifically inside the narcissist during and after this kind of betrayal. Because harming someone who gave everything produces a uniquely intense version of the internal disturbance we discussed in an earlier conversation. The scale of the giving matters here in a specific psychological way. Betraying someone who gave you very little to lose access to costs relatively little internally, but betraying someone whose devotion was extraordinary, whose sacrifice was genuinely significant, creates a correspondingly larger gap between the reframed narrative the narcissist needs to construct and the observable reality of what was actually lost. This larger gap requires more elaborate, more effortful psychological defense mechanisms to manage, which is precisely why narcissists who hurt their most devoted partners often display more intense, more obvious defensiveness when this specific relationship comes up, more aggressive reframing, more desperate narrative reconstruction than they typically display regarding relationships that required less significant sacrifice from the other person. The fourth thing that happens involves a specific social dynamic that deserves honest examination, because it often compounds the original hurt in ways that feel almost as painful as the initial betrayal itself. People witnessing this dynamic from outside, friends, family members, mutual acquaintances, frequently struggle to fully comprehend how someone could hurt a partner who gave so visibly, so consistently, so generously, and this struggle sometimes produces an uncomfortable, unintended consequence. a subtle shift toward questioning the giver's own account of events, wondering privately whether the situation must be more complicated than it appears, because surely no one would treat someone who gave everything with genuine, sustained cruelty without some significant provocation or misunderstanding involved. This skepticism, however unintentional, often isolates the person who was hurt precisely when they need support and validation most, adding a layer of social confusion on top of an already devastating personal betrayal. The fifth thing that happens is a specific, gradual transformation in how the person who was hurt relates to their own capacity for generosity going forward. A transformation that deserves careful, nuanced attention because it can develop in either a healthy or an unhealthy direction depending on how the aftermath is processed. In the unhealthy version of this transformation, the person concludes that their generosity itself was the problem, that giving deeply and sacrificially is simply too dangerous to risk again, leading to a kind of permanent defensive withholding in future relationships that ultimately costs them the genuine connection they're actually still capable of and still deserve. In the healthier version, which typically requires more deliberate processing and often professional support, the person learns instead to distinguish between generosity itself, which remains a genuine strength worth protecting, and the specific lack of discernment about who deserves that generosity, which is the actual lesson this experience offers, allowing them to remain capable of deep giving while becoming significantly more careful about who actually earns access to it. The sixth thing that happens, and this is perhaps the most important consequence to understand because it shapes everything about how healing eventually unfolds, is the specific, prolonged difficulty in reconciling two seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously: that the relationship contained genuine moments of real connection, real intimacy, real love that wasn't entirely fabricated or performed, and that the same person capable of those genuine moments was also capable of causing devastating harm to someone who had given them everything. This reconciliation is genuinely difficult, more difficult than processing a relationship that was consistently, obviously bad from the beginning, because the presence of real, genuine goodness alongside devastating harm creates a kind of psychological complexity that doesn't resolve into a simple, clean narrative the way more straightforwardly negative relationships eventually can. Learning to hold both truths simultaneously without needing to fully resolve the tension between them into a single coherent story becomes one of the most important, most challenging tasks facing anyone recovering from this specific kind of devastating betrayal. Learning to hold both truths simultaneously without needing to fully resolve the tension between them into a single coherent story becomes one of the most important, most challenging tasks facing anyone recovering from this specific kind of devastating betrayal. And this is exactly where I want to take the rest of our conversation, because understanding these 6 consequences is only useful if it also equips you with a genuine path through them, one that acknowledges the real difficulty of this specific kind of healing without minimizing it or rushing toward premature resolution. The first thing worth understanding about actually healing from this specific kind of betrayal is why conventional advice about moving on often falls short when applied to this particular situation. Most general guidance about healing from difficult relationships assumes a relatively straightforward narrative. Someone treated you badly. You're better off without them. Focus on rebuilding your life and self-worth going forward. This advice, while not wrong, often feels hollow and insufficient when applied to a relationship where you genuinely gave everything, because it doesn't account for the specific grief of having your extraordinary generosity met with cruelty rather than reciprocal care, and it doesn't address the particular disorientation of the relational logic collapse we discussed in the first part of this conversation. Genuine healing here requires something more specific than simply moving on. It requires actively rebuilding the relational logic that was disrupted, consciously reconstructing your understanding of how giving and receiving are supposed to work, rather than simply hoping time alone will restore that understanding without any deliberate effort on your part. The second thing worth understanding is how to address the specific self-doubt about your own judgment and perceptiveness that we discussed as the second consequence, because this particular form of self-doubt requires targeted, specific correction rather than simply general reassurance. The most effective approach involves actively, deliberately separating what you couldn't have known during the relationship's early stages from what became visible only later, once enough time and enough specific incidents had accumulated to reveal the actual pattern. This isn't about excusing yourself from any responsibility for staying longer than might have been wise once patterns did become visible. It's about accurately, honestly acknowledging that skilled deception, particularly from someone capable of sustained, convincing performance during a relationship's early stages, isn't something reasonable perceptiveness alone can always detect. And concluding that your judgment is fundamentally flawed because you were deceived by someone specifically skilled at deception is applying an unfair, inaccurate standard that wouldn't reasonably apply to almost anyone in your position. The third thing worth exploring is how to process the specific social isolation we discussed as the fourth consequence, the uncomfortable skepticism from people who struggle to understand how someone could hurt a partner who gave so visibly and so generously. This particular challenge often requires a specific kind of discernment about which relationships in your support network are actually capable of holding the full complexity of what you experienced, and which relationships, however well-intentioned, simply don't have the capacity to fully understand a dynamic this psychologically complicated. This doesn't mean abandoning people who initially struggle to fully grasp your experience, but it does mean being selective about who you turn to for deep, validating support during the most vulnerable parts of your healing, reserving that specific need for people who've demonstrated genuine capacity to sit with complexity rather than needing a simpler, more easily digestible narrative in order to offer their support. The fourth thing worth understanding, and this deserves genuinely careful attention because it addresses the healthy versus unhealthy transformation we discussed regarding your future capacity for generosity, is how to actually practice the healthier version of this transformation, rather than defaulting into the more common, more understandable pattern of permanent defensive withholding. This healthier transformation requires developing something we might call discerning generosity, a practice that involves consciously, deliberately extending trust and deep investment gradually, based on accumulated evidence of someone's actual character and consistency over time, rather than either withholding generosity entirely out of fear or extending it immediately and completely the way you may have done before this experience taught you the cost of doing so without adequate discernment. This isn't about becoming less generous as a person. It's about becoming more intentional about the pacing and sequencing of that generosity, allowing genuine character to reveal itself through sustained observation before extending the same depth of investment that was previously offered too quickly, too completely, too soon. The fifth thing worth understanding is how to actually work through the complex, difficult reconciliation we discussed as the sixth consequence, the challenge of holding both genuine goodness and devastating harm as simultaneously true about the same person and the same relationship. This reconciliation typically benefits from a specific reframe, rather than trying to determine which version of the relationship was real, the loving moments or the harmful ones, as though only one can be genuinely true while the other must have been performance or manipulation. It's often more accurate and more psychologically manageable to accept that both were genuinely real, existing simultaneously within someone whose psychological structure allowed for real connection and real harm to coexist without the internal contradiction that would trouble someone with a more integrated, more consistent character. This reframe doesn't minimize the harm or excuse it, but it does relieve you of the impossible task of retroactively deciding that everything good you experienced must have been fake simply because it existed alongside genuine cruelty, a task that tends to produce more confusion and more difficulty than the more nuanced, more honest acceptance that people, even deeply flawed people, can be capable of real moments of genuine connection alongside devastating harm. I want to talk now about something that deserves particular attention specifically because this conversation has focused on someone who gave everything, because the depth of that giving actually contains something valuable worth reclaiming, separate entirely from the specific person who failed to honor it appropriately. The capacity for that kind of deep, generous, sacrificial love isn't itself the problem, even though it might feel that way in the immediate aftermath of this kind of betrayal. It's actually a remarkable capacity, one that speaks to your own depth of character, your own genuine ability to love fully and completely, qualities that remain entirely yours, regardless of what happened with this specific person who proved unworthy of receiving them. The work ahead isn't diminishing this capacity or protecting yourself by giving less fully in the future. It's learning to direct that same remarkable capacity toward people who've actually demonstrated, through sustained, consistent evidence over time, that they're capable of receiving and reciprocating it appropriately. I also want to address something important about timeline and expectation, because healing from this specific kind of devastating betrayal genuinely takes longer and unfolds less predictably than healing from relationships involving less significant sacrifice and investment. This isn't a reflection of anything wrong with how you're processing what happened. It's simply an accurate acknowledgement that the depth of what you gave correlates reasonably with the depth of processing required to eventually move through this experience toward genuine peace. Give yourself permission to move through this timeline without comparing your progress to more generic expectations about how quickly someone should recover from a difficult relationship. Because your specific situation, involving genuinely extraordinary giving met with genuinely devastating cruelty, deserves a timeline calibrated to its actual significance rather than to some generic standard that doesn't account for what you actually experienced and actually lost. I want to say something directly now to anyone listening who recognizes their own experience in everything we've discussed today, who gave everything to someone who ultimately used that giving as an opportunity for cruelty rather than an invitation toward genuine reciprocity and care. What happened to you reveals something true and important about the person who hurt you, but it reveals nothing true or accurate about your own worth, your own judgment, or your own capacity for genuine, deep connection. The scale of your giving was never actually the mistake. The mistake, if we can even call it that, was extending that giving to someone who proved incapable of receiving it with the care and reciprocity it genuinely deserved. And that mistake, if it even qualifies as one, is a far more forgivable, far more human error than the fundamental character flaw of cruelty you were actually up against. So picture this, the way we often close these conversations, not a dramatic scene of confrontation or vindication, but something quieter, something that reflects the actual gradual nature of healing from this specific kind of profound betrayal. Picture yourself, months or years past this experience, encountering someone new who deserves the depth of care you're genuinely capable of offering, and noticing, with something between relief and quiet pride, that your capacity for genuine generosity remains fully intact, even while your discernment about who actually deserves that generosity has grown significantly wiser, significantly more careful, through everything this specific, difficult experience taught you. Picture yourself giving again, fully, genuinely, but this time with the kind of earned wisdom that ensures your giving lands somewhere it will actually be honored, rather than somewhere it will simply be exploited by someone incapable of appreciating what they were actually being offered. Because that is the real, quiet, cinematic truth beneath everything we've explored today. When a narcissist hurts the person who gave them everything, the tragedy isn't simply the immediate cruelty itself, devastating as that cruelty genuinely is. It's the risk that the person who gave so much might conclude incorrectly that their capacity for that kind of giving was somehow the flaw requiring correction, rather than understanding the more accurate, more liberating truth that their capacity for deep, generous love remains one of their most genuine strengths, one worth protecting and eventually offering again, not to someone who proved unworthy of it, but to someone whose character, revealed through patient, careful observation over time, actually deserves the extraordinary gift of being loved the way you already know, better than almost anyone exactly how to give to.